Bir sonraki yayınımız Ben Morse'la birlikte. Beni yayına alabiliriz sanırım. Hazır kendisi. Hello, Ben.
Oh, hey. How are you?
Yeah, I'm fine. And you? We are streaming now.
Oh, yeah. I see my face on there. Yeah, I woke up like half an hour ago, so I'm mostly awake.
Yeah.
It's almost 9 o'clock over here in the New York area.
Yeah, it's just morning right now, right?
Yeah, I wake up sort of late, I admit it.
Okay, I just want to say hello and thanks for now your presentation. I'm just leaving you with your viewers, okay?
All right. Thank you.
Ciao.
See you later. So, hi, people. I'm sorry, I was saying I woke up recently. This is true. I woke up maybe 20 or 30 minutes ago because it's almost 9 o'clock over here in New Jersey, near New York. Let's see if I can share my screen here. All right, hold on a second. Share screen. Because we're casual here today. I think this is the right thing to share. That looks good. Okay, that's my talk. All right, perfect. So, hey, good to meet you. We're here to discuss AMP in 2020. And thanks for meeting with me today. Usually we run this thing called the AMP Roadshow, where we go around the world and have mini conferences talking about AMP and the web, and how to make good, fast web pages in various kinds of ways. Last year, we were fortunate enough to get to Istanbul, and this year we wanted to go back to Turkey and other places, but all of our plans got canceled due to COVID-19. So here we are, and I'm back home here in New Jersey, near New York, where things have gotten better. I hope you're safe where you are. And even though I can't meet you in person, which is unfortunate, it's good to meet you this way. It's actually much quicker than having to travel somewhere across the world or something. It's actually just I walk up to my attic here and turn on my computer. So good to meet you. My name is Ben Morse. I'm a developer advocate at Google. My job is to work on the web, helping the web be faster and more beautiful and easier to use for users and also for developers. So we're here to talk about AMP today, a few different things. If AMP is new for you, what is AMP really? What is AMP? We're going to find out. And then also what's new in AMP? AMP is changing in some pretty big ways, especially as it relates to Google search. We'll be talking about that. And then as time permits, talking about web stories and talking about AMP and WordPress. I know there were a couple of talks about PWA today, so we're going to discuss very, very briefly AMP and progressive web apps, and maybe even if we have time, talk about JavaScript. So please put comments in the chat if you'd like to. I'll try to answer those things as we go. So first of all, what is AMP? And of course, why? Why is AMP? Well, the web is a wonderful place full of incredible things. We love the web. We're here because we love the web, right? And full of amazing, amazing, amazing different kinds of things. The thing is, the web can be harder to use if pages have too much stuff on them. Too much JavaScript, too much CSS, too many different things happening can make pages cluttered and slow to load. And sometimes things also don't work fast on pages like this. A page full of a lot of code and long tasks that happen in JavaScript frameworks. If you are a user and try to do something, you might press a button on your screen and for a while nothing happens because JavaScript is still loading or executing, or there's long tasks blocking the browser. So for all these reasons, it can be a problem. Now, web pages with a lot of stuff are often fine on a desktop. People still prefer faster web pages, even on desktop computers, but it's not the same kind of problem. It's not as bad if you're on a 4G connection and you're in a major city with great Wi-Fi, great data. But for many people, that isn't their experience. Often you're traveling somewhere and you are facing worse connections, maybe 3G, maybe worse sometimes. Many people also live in rural areas or countries where, you know, the connections aren't that fast. And of course, many people have phones that aren't like the latest iPhone, the latest Galaxy, the latest Pixel, phones that just are slower. And phones that are slower and have slower processors tend to be much slower with JavaScript. So in fact, the latest stat that I saw showed that actually the average mobile web page takes 12 seconds to load on 3G. And 12 seconds is kind of a lot. That's not great, but it could be even worse. In fact, it turns out that the last stats that I saw showed that 40% of connections worldwide are 2G connections. And you may have experienced this. 2G connections, things load very slowly if they load at all. So to make a web page that works for everybody, everywhere who wants to use your web page, it's better if it has less code, less CSS, if the page has smaller images, if it's lighter. As long as it's the same kind of experience, why not put less stuff in it? Well, the problem is it's kind of hard sometimes. It requires a lot of work. If you don't do it, though, you'll have this guy over here looking at your website at this beautiful cafe, and he's waiting for it to load. It hasn't loaded yet. Look how stressed out he is. Look how unhappy he is. In fact, he's taken up smoking and drinking to cope with the stress of making your site load so slowly. So to save this man's life, to make his life longer and better, it's your obligation to make your site faster. The problem is it can be hard. It takes a lot of things to learn. You have to do a lot of different things to compress your bundle sizes. And if you're at a larger company, to make sure no one else adds more code or more large images to your site, it takes work. And we find that people try to get performance to work, and they often can't make sites much faster anyway, except for smaller sort of one-person sites. This is why AMP was created. AMP was created as an open source project started by Google, now mostly run by Google, but also it belongs to OpenJS now. Google gave the project of the OpenJS family and made by developers all over the world. AMP is a way to make it easier to make sites that are faster and better for users. What is AMP? Very simply, it is a web components library. These are a couple of the examples of web components AMP has. So HTML, when it was created, of course, was made for things like describing documents. It was made 30 years ago when the web had no images even, for example. So HTML is full of tags like, this is a paragraph. This is a division on the page. Put this in boldface. It doesn't have tags for things like make a mobile menu, make an image slider where you can use your fingers to slide images around the screen, embed a tweet over here. Those things didn't exist back then. People add this kind of functionality to the web by using JavaScript, which is fine unless there's a lot of JavaScript, in which case it gets kind of messy. So what AMP does is what other web components libraries do. It has new tags to HTML that do those interactive things people usually use JavaScript for. So AMP adds new tags to HTML. Those tags are made possible by AMP's own JavaScript, which makes those things actually work. Conversely, AMP historically discourages you from writing your own JavaScript. It wants you to use its JavaScript and use built-in tags and to build your page with HTML and CSS and just a little bit of JavaScript. Now, this is changing some because people miss JavaScript. JavaScript is important, but it's still a way that you can make your site faster by having simply less code loaded on your pages. So how does that look in practice? Kind of like this. This is, for example, how you embed a YouTube video with AMP. Instead of embedding YouTube's JavaScript, sorry, it's early in the morning for me here. Instead of embedding YouTube's JavaScript, you instead use this tag called AMP YouTube and use attributes to customize it. So for example, AMP adds this layout attribute to HTML where you can make things responsive just by saying responsive. And then AMP will, if your container increases in size, it will expand the YouTube container. If your container gets smaller, AMP will shrink the video automatically. It also asks you to include width and height from those components. This is a way of making sure the layout is smooth. So one problem with the web, some sites out there, is that you're looking at a page and suddenly a picture loads in, everything shifts down. And then maybe a video loads in, and then things shift around again. Maybe an ad loads in. Worse still, maybe a video ad, and then things keep moving around the screen. This layout is unstable, and it disturbs people to see things shift around the screen. It's much better for users if things load up into their spots, and they just stay there. It also is faster for the browser because the browser isn't repainting everything again and again. So AMP guarantees this by making you specify the size of all elements in advance. This is the best practice for images anyway. AMP requires it for valid AMP, which we'll discuss in a minute. So specifying width and height of things means the size is declared in advance, and as things load up, they pop into their spaces, and the screen doesn't shift around. Finally, data video ID, that also is not part of HTML. This is how AMP lets you tell it what video to load up. This is just the ID of the video. So basically, by giving the size of the elements and specifying the ID of the video, AMP does all the rest of the work for you. If you have questions about this or comments, please put these things in the chat, especially if they're in English. My Turkish is terrible. Okay, let's see what's next over here. Oh, yes. So if you follow the rules AMP sets out, the rules AMP sets out for making a page which is fast and accessible, you get the special treatment where Google will put you into this thing called the Top Stories Carousel if you are a news article. You can see that thing in the middle. This is an example of the US. There is this, I think I have a little pointer here. Look at this, isn't that cool? I never used this pointer feature. Very nice. So this thing in the middle here is called the Top Stories Carousel. All the articles here in this carousel, which you can swipe around with your fingers, all these articles have little badges here indicating they're AMP articles. And these are all things made with AMP. You also can see here other places in the search page, little badges here indicating AMP. AMP pages also appear on desktop search, but this badge does not appear. So these things here load extra fast, which is nice. And also, if you're fortunate, Google search will preload this page in an iframe because it knows AMP will be fast, doesn't load extra JavaScript, and controls when things like images load up. So it knows you can load these things quickly. And then when you click on one of these articles here, it appears almost immediately because it's preloaded. So the goal of AMP is to achieve this idea of instant loading, things load as fast as possible. So more things that AMP will do for you. I told you before, things that are slow are discouraged or not allowed. It makes sure that content doesn't jump around as it's loaded, so you have a stable layout. It also doesn't allow distracting ads or pop-ups that make it harder to see what's on the screen. Also importantly, AMP automatically does what's called in Viewport Prioritization, or sometimes lazy loading. So it doesn't load things until they're needed. So let's say you're looking at your screen over here, and there's a bunch of content, and then there's 3 or 4 pages down. If you scroll down, maybe there's some images down there, maybe a video. AMP will not load those images or that video until you scroll towards it. So things that you want to see first are loaded first. Things down later on the page are loaded later. This, again, you can do yourself, of course, with JavaScript, and now with the lazy loading in HTML, which is becoming part of most browsers. But AMP does these things for you. So this often is a good experience for users, and you can't guarantee more money from anything on the web. But performance, when you work on your site getting faster, it tends to often get you better metrics. People often stay on sites for longer and spend more money on sites that are easier to use because they load faster. AMP tends to have even bigger results like this. This, for example, is Superbalist, a company in South Africa that made their landing pages on their site into AMP. And then the next pages you'd go to are part of the PWA. So you got there quickly with AMP, and then afterwards you were brought into their immersive progressive web app experience. You can see the results they had: much lower bounce rate, better conversion rate, and especially better conversion rates on AMP landing pages versus non-AMP landing pages. Again, you can't guarantee these things, but frequently we see these numbers with AMP that are pretty impressive because people like it. They trust the site more if it loads faster and is more stable. So given all those things there, I thought I had more things to say. I guess I didn't. Oh yeah, this is in the part over here. That's what AMP is. So AMP is changing in ways that are quite interesting. Let's discuss a few of those things now. The main thing I want to talk about is that AMP has been used so far in this way that's kind of apart from the web. So you have an AMP web page or a non-AMP web page, and rarely mix these things together. What's happening is that AMP is becoming part of the web a lot more than it was in a couple of ways. One of these ways is a project called Bento AMP. So right now, people do use AMP components off of AMP pages sometimes. They can mix AMP components with non-AMP components. This is not valid AMP. Valid AMP requires that you use only AMP components on your page and no other JavaScript, except in certain ways we can discuss later. It means following the rules of AMP, basically. And this gets you the advantage of the AMP Top Stories Carousel. If you're a publisher, it gets you the advantage of the AMP cache, where web crawlers out there are looking for valid AMP pages, and they will find valid AMP pages and cache the HTML that then gets served from servers like Google servers, which makes your page load faster. So valid AMP gives you the AMP cache. This is changing now, though, because the team that makes AMP is rewriting all the AMP components. So they're guaranteed to work anywhere, on AMP pages, on regular HTML pages with AMP's JavaScript runtime, which controls the page, or without it. This is a pretty big change for AMP. So again, this usually works now, but it's not guaranteed to work. But now this will be guaranteed to work. So what's happening is that things like this are possible. You could just use, like, for example, AMP fit text, this component, by loading in its JavaScript, and then just go ahead and use jQuery to change the font size and change the text. Again, you can do this today. It wouldn't be a valid AMP case. It wouldn't be guaranteed to always work, but soon it'll be guaranteed to always work. So you use these fast, reliable AMP components anywhere on the web, and they have very little JavaScript, and the AMP team works to make them nice all the time. Or this kind of thing. You could use like a React kind of model. You could wrap the AMP fit text component in your own component, import it, and there you are, use it yourself. So these things will now be part of what you can do with AMP components in the very near future. Another big change for AMP comes from the world of Chrome and the world of Google. So you may have seen this before, especially if you're watching this talk today, Web Vitals, which was discussed a lot in Web.dev live, and that was happening last month. I guess it was last month. There's this new program, Web Vitals. People at Google, the Web Performance Working Group at W3C, and various places spent a long time discussing what kind of metrics were really, really good to discuss what made pages good for users, and came up with Web Vitals. These things over here, you've probably seen this before. Largest contentful paint, a nice way to really measure like how fast something appears on the screen that people can really look at and see. So there's various metrics for how fast things appear on the screen. This one is nice. It's very easy to define and measure. It's simply when the biggest thing that's going to appear above the fold, when that appears. The biggest image, block of text, background image, whatever it's going to be. It's a good measure of how fast things appear on the screen. And then first input delay, a measure of interactivity. So once things appear on the screen, is JavaScript actually loaded and parsed and ready to go? Or is it still loading up and still doing things to make itself ready to go? Or are there long tasks happening in JavaScript that block things from happening? This is a good measure of that. The first input delay, when things are ready on the screen and the user first does something, how long it takes for that thing to actually work. And finally, cumulative layout shifts. So this is a measure, a score of do things move around on the screen a lot as they're loading, or do they just load into their spaces nicely and there they are. So the change that's happening is that these Web Vitals will now be used by Google instead of AMP for the top stories. So Google will be making a new signal that combines the Web Vitals with the existing page experience signals, and then use that to put things in the top stories carousel. So instead of using just AMP there, it'll use that instead. This is nice because AMP has been privileged in this way for a while. Most AMP pages, or many AMP pages, do meet these Web Vitals. Not all of them do. So we think the AMP is still the best way to get there because it's kind of hard to get these Web Vitals without using AMP. Although you should and you can, but AMP is the easiest way to do it, we think. Going forward, you'll be able to use whatever you want to, make your page fast for users, make it stable for users, make it interactive quickly for users, however you want to, and then you'll get top stories carousel in Google search. And also this will be a ranking signal. So AMP is not currently a ranking signal for Google search. Making your page AMP doesn't improve your rating at all, although speed improves your rating, but in the near future, this will be happening. It's not happening yet because people know, Google knows people are out there. We're trying to suffer from trying to figure out how to work from home and how to get things going from home. It's hard right now just to make big changes to our sites. So Google is giving people time to work on Web Vitals for a little while before this becomes part of Google search. So a couple of big changes for AMP. There's an example there of top stories carousel. Again, it'll now be based on page experience and core Web Vitals, not on using AMP alone. Although using AMP is a good way to get there. All right, so that was my main topic for today, what AMP is, how AMP is changing. Now some small mini topics we can discuss while we have some time. Web stories, for example. Web stories are powered by AMP. So what are these things here? Web stories are like a Snapchat or Instagram style story format for the web. The advantage over here is that unlike a walled garden, another kind of app where you don't control the content, maybe it vanishes When you don't want it to, you control it. So this is stories appearing on the web. You own these stories. You have these sites, these pages with stories. You figure out how to use them. And they have nice web features, like you can link to these things from other places on the web. Search engines can discover your web stories. They can be part of any web page. So they're integrated into the web, which has special features because the web, as we know, is nice. And of course, there are these fast immersive experiences where they take over your whole screen. And because they use AMP, they are quick. Some examples of web stories. These are all from the US, it looks like in Britain, but these stories are these nice experiences with video, images, and text, swiping back and forth, clicking on your screen to see these new immersive full screen pages, easy to read. People like these kinds of things. Also, now web stories work on desktop. They were designed for mobile, but of course the web can be responsive very easily, and so can AMP. So now if you make your page responsive, then if you view it on a desktop device, it will go full screen just as it does on mobile. This is an example actually of a war story from the Washington Post that won the Pulitzer Prize, which is a big prize here in the US for journalism. If you have questions or comments on all these things, please do mention it in the chat somewhere. I'm going to actually have some water because I'm still only partially awake here. That seems like it's better. Okay. There's some water. Let's see what else is new over here in web stories. Here's how it looks. Like all things in AMP, it's based on these components. So your page will have an AMP story component, and attributes will be used to give it a title and a publisher and customize it in various ways. And the AMP story component will then contain, as children, pages, AMP story pages. These form the pages we saw here a minute ago. All these pages of your story are AMP story pages. Each page contains one or more layers. These layers contain stuff like images, text, videos, sound, whatever they are. So the AMP story component is the parent of the whole page that then contains AMP story pages, which contain these layers. Layers contain stuff. And that's how you do it. You can make stories this way with HTML. There also are a few nice tools that are making stories, or independent tools that exist for making stories, and also a good WordPress plugin for making stories too out of WordPress. These things appear in Google search in a couple different ways. These can appear in the top stories carousel. They can appear in usual places in stories. They also can appear in certain countries in the Discover feed and other places in Google search. I think this right now is just in the US, in Brazil, and India. They're still working on trying these things out here and testing them out in these countries. As they make things the way they want to, they will start to roll this out to other countries in the world, including, of course, I would imagine, Turkey. I don't know what the plans actually are for this, but hopefully at some point soon we'll see these things. I see a question about PWA and AMP. A great question, because actually I have this, I think it's next in my presentation. Do I? Actually, we're getting there pretty soon. We're going to do WordPress next and then PWA. So thanks for this question. WordPress also is a popular way to make websites. It's by some measures, 30%, 40% of the web is made with WordPress. So people who work on AMP also invest in making AMP work well on WordPress. There's this nice plugin called the AMP for WordPress plugin, which was made by people at XWP and Google, other folks in collaboration. There's various plugins for AMP for WordPress. This one is nice because it has a lot of stuff built in. We've seen engineers spending a lot of time working on this, making it really easy to use. It's at amp-wp.org. And they've worked hard on making all of the major themes compatible with AMP. So all the named themes like 2011 through 2020, all of these themes here are already AMP compatible. And it does various things to make your page valid AMP easily. It'll convert images to AMP images and to give you the dimensions there you need for AMP to be happy. It'll take your CSS styles and put them in line, because AMP requires you for valid AMP to have your CSS be in line to avoid another network request. It does those things for you. It finds all the CSS on the page and tries to squash it down as much as possible and puts it in line. It does other things for you. If you have custom JavaScript in your plugins, AMP doesn't want custom JavaScript. It'll take that out for you and warn you about it and tell you where you have to actually replace that kind of functionality with other kinds of functionality using AMP. Now, of course, valid AMP is not required to use AMP, but the AMP WordPress plugin does encourage it because there's advantages to valid AMP. One very nice thing that it does that's hard to do otherwise is it does tree shaking for you. So AMP wants you to have less than 75K of total CSS. It's hard to figure out where CSS is being used, not being used. You look in the code coverage tab in Chrome DevTools, you'll find that most pages use maybe 10% of their CSS, maybe less than that. Most CSS goes unused. So the WordPress plugin will look at all the CSS on your page, look at your HTML, compare these things, and see which CSS actually is being used and keep just that CSS. So it can remove the CSS that isn't being used, or a lot of that, and then combine that into a smaller bundle of CSS, thereby making your page load faster and making AMP faster. The plugin has various advantages. Again, try it out, and it'll help guide you towards making your WordPress pages AMP compatible. Now, onto your question over here, AMP and PWA. We have a whole talk on this as well. I only have about 4 slides in this talk over here at PWA. There are different technologies. They're quite different. Of course, AMP is more of like a mostly HTML, mostly CSS, low JavaScript way of making fast pages. PWA is more of a very heavy JavaScript way of controlling the whole page with JavaScript. But in fact, they're quite compatible, work very well together. One common pattern I see is, this is back in the presentation. Let's go back over here if I can find it. Look at that. That was the slide. That was a rare moment in presentation history. That's the slide number I was looking for, 15. So this is an example of this where they use a component called AMP install service worker. It's a common pattern to take your pages people get to from search or get to first, because making those pages fast is kind of the most important speed thing on your site. Take those pages, make those pages AMP pages. So the user loads your page very quickly from search or from wherever they got there from. They're there looking at your page. While they're looking at your content and scrolling through your page, AMP install service worker is installing your service worker. That JavaScript is loading up, is starting up and executing, and your service worker goes ahead and it starts running and begins to control the page. So then the very next click they actually do, next click, the next tap, they're brought right there into PWA. So it's kind of like a start fast, stay fast kind of pattern. You begin with AMP, you go to PWA from there, and you're always on this fast page, and you're this fast immersive experience. It's a nice pattern. Let's go back to our presentation over here. We were over here before. There's more ways to do it, which I'm fond of. For example, one is that AMP pages can be embedded within PWAs. Any element on a page can contain, using shadow DOM and shadow AMP, an AMP page. So you can embed your AMP page inside a PWA. This is a pretty cool pattern as well. But I see the first pattern more often, where the first page is AMP and subsequent pages are PWA. To make this easier, the AMP team has released a one-line service worker. They have gone ahead and made a nice service worker that's a default service worker that makes your AMP pages into network resilient PWA experiences without you making any code at all. You can customize these things too if you want to, but simply to use it, you go ahead and import this script over here from the AMP project SW amp-sw.js, initialize it, and there you are. Again, you can take this JavaScript and copy it, customize it for your use case, but this is a basic way to use PWA with AMP nicely. I think I'm going to skip my next part of the presentation because I'm running out of time. But this was about AMP and JavaScript. There's a new thing called AMP script, where you can use JavaScript and web workers, and it's pretty nice. Web workers are a way to run JavaScript off the main thread, and AMP makes this easy with AMP script. Let's see. Anyway, let me show you an example real quick over here. This is how it will look. If you use AMP script, you can put JavaScript over here, and then AMP will grab it, put it into a worker, run it off the main thread. And we're skipping all this because we're running out of time. To learn more about this, though, try this tutorial here. Try going to go amp-dev/learn script, and it's kind of interesting. Let's see. I'm going to skip ahead from all these things. Oh, yeah, you can use React with that and Preact in AMP script, which is nice. But let's go to some final things about AMP because we're running out of time, I believe. I'm checking my chat over here. How's our time? I don't know, but probably we're almost done. So let's go to the final slides here. If I have more time, I'll go back. AMP is an open source project. You're encouraged to contribute to this because it's a nice way to get involved in AMP or an open source project. Again, people that work on it, a lot of them are for Google, but not all of them are from Google. And in fact, recently, it was given over to the OpenJS Foundation. This was announced at OpenJS World, their events back in June. that now it belongs to the OpenJS Foundation. So it's an open source project for the good of the web. To learn more about AMP also, you can try these courses over here. If you go to go.amp.dev/learn, these courses help you learn AMP by working on projects. There's a beginning course, intermediate, and advanced. You make a simple AMP web page and learn how to add interactivity, menus, data binding, things like that. Try these things out. Am I out of time now, by the way? Do I have any more time? Because I know it's been about half an hour. It is here 9:25. Probably there it's 4:25. Oh, good. Now I'm back. Sorry about that. These things happen sometimes. Anyway, I assume I'm out of time, so I'm just going to go to the last slide over here. This is me, Ben Morse on Twitter. Come say hello, and feel free to ask questions or make comments about the web, AMP, anything else. And I guess that's all I have really then, unless there's more questions here in the chat. In that case, thank you very much. I think Martin's up next. Well, you know any good jokes? If we have more time, I could talk some more. I thought we were done, though. Well, I'll talk for a minute or two more because otherwise you have the awkward long pause over here. Let's go back to other slides I didn't do before. And when we're out of time, we're out of time. JavaScript and AMP, a whole other topic. So web workers are this thing that have been around for a long time, but aren't used very much. They've been around for about 10 years or so. They're not used very much because they're kind of hard to use because they can't actually access the DOM. Web workers are this way of making JavaScript work in a separate thread. Oh, wait, hold on. Okay, now we're going to stop again. Let's go back to our last slide over here. Yeah, more things.
Hello.
We are. Hi.
Our time is over. So there is a question. Did you see that?
Let's see. I saw one question a while ago that I did speak to already about PWA.
Okay. Yeah,
I think that's about it, though.
I think there is no question more. If you're done, we can finish the live stream and
yeah, sure.
Martin is ready for.
Let's go on to Martin.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Ben.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Everything can reach on your social media accounts, right?
Yeah, feel free to say hello on Twitter or wherever else you want to.
Okay. Thank you so much, and see you soon.
Thanks. Take care.